Welcome, everybody, to a new edition of UFO Man Live. My name is Tim, or UFO Man, and to my side is my co-host, Tom Reed from Inner Space TV. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, thanks for having me again, Tim. Appreciate it.
Yeah, tonight we have a very special guest. His name is Don Schmitt. He is a 6-time best-selling author and the former co-director of the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, also known as CUFOS, where he served as the director of special investigations for 10 years, a co-founder of the world-famous International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, which, by the way, is having their, I think it's the 75th anniversary of Roswell this year. When is that? July 4th?
The 4th of July weekend, actually the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So Friday, Saturday, Sunday of July.
Okay. He serves there as an advisor to the board of directors. He is also an internationally known investigative reporter and lecturer. His first book, UFO Crash at Roswell, was made into the Golden Globe nominated film Roswell. Also, it was the #1 book in the world in 2007 and 2008. So that is a big kudo to Don Schmitt. And by the way, Don, I owned that movie for years.
Thank you,
Roswell.
Jeff.
And yes. we actually have the 1994 trailer to that film.
Yes.
Which we would like to play right at this moment.
Please.
So
go
here
ahead.
we go.
Love to see it again.
Roswell, New Mexico, in 1947.
This local rancher just brought in a whole lot of, I don't know what you'd call it, but he claims it all came down at his place, and the sheriff thinks it might be something you guys sent up.
Our government encountered something.
Something, top secret.
Beyond our capacity to understand.
Couldn't have been anything of ours.
I mean, how in the hell was that thing held together?
Look at this.
A power so terrifying.
It's as light as a feather.
I mean, what the hell are we dealing with here? Is it friendly? Is it hostile?
A secret so dangerous.
From now on, you're not to talk to anyone about this. That includes your family.
That rancher was threatened. The sheriff was threatened. They threatened me.
What the hell is this?
It could forever change the world as we know it.
What if people think that we are not in control of the skies?
They'd be right.
Nobody is going to take you seriously, not without proof.
Now, it's time you learn the truth.
I saw the bodies.
What bodies?
Now, at last, you will believe.
You may be the first person in human history ever to see writing from another world.
It wasn't a lie.
It was alive.
I know what I saw, and it was not from this world.
You have nothing.
Martin Sheen, Kyle MacLachlan, Roswell.
I love it.
That was a very good film.
And it's what amazes me, both Tim and Tom, is how many people within the UFO field have never seen that movie.
Wow.
I mean, the fact that we were approached before we even wrote that book, UFO Crash at Roswell, to option the book before it was released, with the hope that it could be made into a motion picture. And the executive producer, Paul Davids, I spent with Paul the better part of 3 years in LA, almost every other month, and we were knocking on doors. We were meeting with studio executives at Columbia Pictures, at Paramount, at Fox Television. We were meeting with the likes of Robert Wise, who directed The Day the Earth Stood Still, which I consider the best UFO movie ever made. And I'll tell you an interesting story about that in a second. And we final office. And we reached the point of going into actual casting. That's how far we were into pre-production. And Michael Fuchs, who was the president of HBO at that time, was meeting at his main office in New York. And he hopped back on his Lear jet, fly back to LA. And on the flight, he calls up Jeremy Kagan, our director, and says, "We're canceling, we're dropping out, too controversial." And I'll never forget Paul Davids calling me just devastated. "Don, that's it. We're done." And I was the one who immediately suggested, "Well, why don't you take it across the street?" It so happened that Eileen Kahn was a producer who worked both at HBO and Showtime. So she was already on board with the project at HBO. All you have to do is take it over by her and see if Showtime would jump at the opportunity. We had a deal with Showtime within a week.
Nice.
Wow.
And the rest is history. We were, Kevin Randall, my partner at that time, we were involved beyond the book. We were involved with the writing of the script. Just imagine, we had a playwright, Arthur Coppett, who did the screenplay.
Wow.
And the cast from top to bottom are all big name actors. And for a made-for-TV movie, they were so keen on the project that they filmed it in 35 millimeter because they thought it was a sure hit to go feature, make the theaters, which it did initially. New York, LA, Chicago, Washington, D.C. And Kevin and I were technical consultants on the picture. We were there for all the exterior filming, not in New Mexico. We filmed in Bisbee, southeastern Arizona. We had a production office in Sierra Vista, about an hour away. And we would, Kevin always told me that, Don, we're just going to be the writers. It's our book, but they're going to treat us like a couple of tourists. Well, that was not the case at all, you two. They had chairs for us with the camera, with the director. We sat there, and the director, Jeremy Kagan, constantly waving us over to look at the filming. And then to sit and watch the daily rushes each evening. And Jeremy turning around and going, "What do you think of this, boys? What do you and watching the daily filming, that type of thing." So when we had first arrived on the set, even, and I'm tapped on the shoulder, and I turn around, and at first I don't see anybody. And then I look down, and I go, "Bobby?" And it was Mike Lukenland, Bobby Brady of the Brady Bunch. Well, he was our second camera, our head grip. And he is shaking my, "Mr. Schmidt, I am so proud to be part of your movie," that type of thing. And that's how we were treated throughout the entire, we filmed in November of 93 through December. All the interiors we filmed in North LA.
Wow.
I spent a lot of time with Martin Sheen just walking around and talking about everything outside of Hollywood. First thing he said to me at that time was, "I'll talk about anything but Charlie," his son Charlie. But I've remained in contact with Dwight Yoakam all these years, who played the rancher Mac Brazel. Dwight's manager will call up whenever he's performing within a few states in the neighborhood, and Dwight's got 2 tickets for you and your wife, and make sure you come backstage, that type of thing. But I mentioned Robert Wise, who directed The Day the Earth Stood Still. When we had the premiere of the Roswell movie at the Directors Guild in Hollywood, and afterwards, who immediately came up to us and just shook our hands over and over again. "I am so proud of you boys," but Robert Wise. So, as I had mentioned, my favorite UFO movie is still The Day the Earth Stood Still. So, after my scientific director, my mentor, my dear friend, the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek, had finished filming Close Encounters of the Third Kind with Steven Spielberg. And we had a dinner celebration at the Hynek residence. And I was in the kitchen afterwards with J. Allen. And I commented, so Allen, I suppose now Close Encounters is your favorite UFO movie. And he went, no, I still agree with you. It's still the day the earth stood still. So I have been so blessed that people, and when we were nominated Best Made for TV Movie, Golden Globes, we were invited. We were the writers. It was based on our book. Guess where Kevin Randall and I were that night?
Where?
In New Mexico, working on the case. We
Wow.
felt that was more important. And that Sunday evening, we're sitting in the front lobby of a Ramada Inn in Albuquerque, New Mexico, watching the awards ceremony, looking at one another and going, this is the stupidest thing we have ever done in our lives. We should be there. He can always come back to New Mexico, but as if it's going to happen again in a single lifetime. But that's how devoted, how committed we were. But we'll regret it the rest of my life.
Obviously, from all the books that you've written about Roswell and all the different projects concerning Roswell, I can see that you're very devoted. Yes.
Thank you. Yes.
Tom, do you have a question?
Well, I was just going to say, I know Bob Wise. I actually had, Robert, I actually had breakfast with him about a year and a half ago in Sheffield, Massachusetts.
Well, you're thinking about the actor.
No, the film producer.
Because, Robert Wise, the director who did Sound of Music.
Okay, he teamed up with Cosgrove Amuro. Is that the same Bob Wise or Robert Wise?
No, because because the Robert Wise would go all the way back to Citizen Kane. He was the line producer for Orson Welles.
Okay, this is a different one then. Yeah.
So Wise has been gone now about 10 years.
Oh no, different one. Obviously. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I thought, wow, I know him too. But actually, we do have a familiar friend, or at least he used to, Robert Bletchman.
Yes.
Worked with my father. Yeah.
Absolutely, Bob Bletchman, correct. Yeah, and he was out in California as well. So.
Yeah, and he organized the United Nations Symposium, I think, back in '92.
He was part of that, correct? Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. So anyway, as far as the Roswell thing goes, I mean, you have a new book written as well, correct? That's maybe out about a year now. Our
publisher, Michael Pye, had contacted us over a year ago about why don't we, and just to correct you for a moment, Tim, you had mentioned that our first book, UFO Crash at Roswell, was the #1 selling UFO book in the world.
Yeah,
for
that
2000
wasn't the right one.
2000.
Oh, he's frozen.
Yeah.
8. It was that received that honor, and our publisher, Michael Pye, as I mentioned, suggested that we would come out with a 75th anniversary edition. And what new material could we add? So we wrote 2 new chapters. We updated each other chapter. We sprinkled in new witnesses. We added new visuals throughout. We added updated appendices as far as throughout the book, and a whole new jacket. And so it's the 75th anniversary edition of Witness.
This one right here.
That is correct.
Okay. This is the book that he's talking about, everybody in the chat and who's watching online. So if you're interested, where is this book available, Don?
It's available certainly at Barnes & Noble, all fine bookstores throughout the country, and Amazon. And we were informed that within 2 days after its release on Amazon, it had risen up to within the top 10, actually number 2 of all UFO books at that time. So we can add another bestseller, I guess. So,
you're on a roll.
Yeah, well,
everybody wants to know about Roswell. One thing I want to point out is I interviewed Michael Schratt a few months ago, and he revealed an exclusive sketch that he said had never been shown online before of the last remaining alien survivor from that crash. And here's that photo. Right there.
Right.
And these are soldiers looking at this being behind a glass panel in a corner, kind of like cubicle.
Well, it is a sketch, and Michael had consulted with me as to the circumstances, and it involved specifically Lieutenant Colonel Marion Magruder, who was with the War College class of 47-48. He was a AAA for World War II. And he described to his sons before passing in 1995 that they were taken. They were on assignment at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And from all accounts, all testimonies, that's where the wreckage and bodies and the survivor were taken following the crash. So Magruder would tell his sons that they were shown samples of the wreckage, the memory material, the nearly indestructible metal-like, weightless, paper-thin material that you could crumble and crease and fold, and yet you place it down and it would slowly assume its original shape and size with no sign of any damage. And then they were taken to another room, and the lights came on behind as far as a glass wall, and they're sitting in a chair. When it lifted its head, they were told was the survivor from Roswell. And Magruder would describe how he felt great pity, that his heart went out to this being, that he felt as though they were treating it like a caged animal, like a guinea pig, and that it was his information thereafter that it died within just a matter of weeks after their viewing this being. Now, we located the documents that confirmed that Magruder was assigned to Wright-Pat in April of 1948. So he was there, and he was on assignment with the War College. So they were bringing in a lot of people, just trying to get every educated opinion as to what they should do. I always make the comment, gentlemen, that there was nothing in the Army Field Manual back in 1947 of how to deal with this. Crash UFO, crash saucer, that type of thing.
Right.
Survivor, what page is that on? So, in describing all this to Michael, and in conjunction, we have the scene, as you both know, in the Roswell movie with the Secretary of War, James Forrestal, and almost that telepathic communication with the survivor. You will note, too, that the depiction of the alien is more like the alien in the Roswell movie. Now, I mentioned that because, and Tom knows about this, we have the lone surviving prop of the bodies from the Roswell movie. Now, Paul Davids, the executive producer, he has in his possession the actual animatronic alien, the survivor, within a glass container. It's preserved that way. Whereas the museum, we have the body on a gurney, and we have it within an autopsy scene, that type of thing. But we made sure that with the movie, that there would not be an accurate portrayal of the bodies of the survivor. Now, why do you think we would do that?
Mimic.
To protect
Well, and it was at a time when most of the witnesses were still alive, and we were working, as I described, for failing the Golden Globe Awards, that we were hot on the trail. We were making every effort to track down and locate each and every one of these people. We had the base yearbook from 1947, so we had over 3,000 names, pictures of who to focus on. It's just a matter of it was back in 47 back in 1989 when we started, and so the Golden Globes was in 94. That it was still at a time that you just couldn't go to a CD-ROM or go online and find these people. You had to actually track them down,
right?
Which we successfully did. And so we made sure that we did not salt the field, so to speak, that we didn't put out anything that potentially would contaminate, lead, or coach potential witnesses.
Right.
And we, on several occasions, had potential witnesses describe exactly that prop at the museum.
Then you know they're not telling the truth.
Exactly. So it wasn't to entrap anyone as much as it was to secure as much control data as possible to then be able to cross-check with information. So what Michael's illustrator did was it's mainly based on the movie. It's not based on the actual eyewitness accounts, and the depiction of the alien being is not even close. It's more like the movie prop. So
okay, so that sketch I put out just recently in the live here is not accurate then.
No, it's close. It's close, but then it's not close. And one of the things we had worked with Hollywood animatronic expert Mike Hill. And Mike Hill, if you ever saw the movie Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example, and those scenes with when they're exposed to the Martian atmosphere,
right,
and they're suffocating and their faces are contorted. He did those prosthetics.
Okay.
The Octopus Man in the one Spider-Man movie. He did the arms, the tentacles.
Cool.
So they were involved as far as in doing as far as all of this prosthetics as far as in these movies. And I had worked with Michael, and the one thing that was always missing based on all the eyewitness accounts is that, and I'm talking specifically about the survivor, that no one ever suggested that we were dealing with anything monstrous, horrible, frightening. The comments over and over again, gentlemen, is that it looked very serene, very peaceful, and as a result, and very nonviolent, very non-threatening. And it's the one thing that was always missing, that our composites, the sketches we would do from the witnesses, was very sterile.
Right.
That picture is very sterile. It's cold.
Like non-emotional. Yeah.
Right. We wanted to create, based on the eyewitnesses, something that would look like you would see it approaching you on the street, and you would not be afraid to walk up to it and shake its hand or engage it. You wouldn't be threatened by it. And we finally captured that.
Now, this information that you got, this is from people that actually, I guess, within that 2 week span, actually interacted with the survivor.
Right, were involved. One, for example, he was his name was Elazar Benavides.
Okay,
and he was part of an MP unit that had just finished guard duty, and he was in his barracks, and he was told to immediately report to the big hangar, which they called Building 84. Back then, it was known as P3. It was a B-29 bomber hangar. And he arrived, and he was issued a rifle. And he described that you could tell that the hangar was under lockdown. The area.
Are we talking this hangar?
Yes. Building 84, B-29, and back then it was called P3. That's exactly the hangar. And you see even the cars are around circa 1947. Well, anyway, the hangar was under heavy exterior guard. He was told to go inside, and then he immediately saw that it was also under guard inside this building. And he noticed vehicles. He noticed a lot of wreckage scattered in an area off to the side of the hangar. And there were a number of gurneys. And they were instructed, he and a number of other enlisted men were instructed to load up the gurneys into the back of an ambulance truck and take them immediately over to the base hospital, which was also on the east side of the base, the Roswell Army Airfield. The first atomic bomb field in the world, the 509 Bomb Wing, first atomic bomb squadron in the world, Roswell Army Airfield. I emphasize that because they were the elite within the military at that time. They were a composite unit where they selected the best officers, best pilots, crew, doctors, nurses. So no question, we're talking about the best the United States military had at that time. So anyway, Benavides is describing how they're loading the gurneys into the back of this ambulance truck. And they were sheet draped, they were sheet covered. And then one of the men accidentally stepped on a corner of one of the sheets, pulling it free. And before he knows it, he's looking face to face with what happened to be under one of those sheets. His immediate reaction was, oh my God, all the rumors about the crashed flying saucer must be true. And here's one of the bodies. And then what just totally floored him to the point that for as long as he lived, he never got over it. The eyes opened. And there he was within inches, face to face. And so those are the types of personal, firsthand accounts we have about the survivor.
Yes, Tom. Can't hear you.
Okay. Why do you think that they covered it up then? What did they actually think it was dead, or were they just trying to move it?
It was just a matter of keeping things
under wraps,
localized, keeping them, everything transited through that hangar. P3.
Okay. Let me ask you this too, if I could follow up. So the 2 weeks that they actually, the survivor was actually alive.
Right.
Did anyone ever back in the day talk about how they were able to communicate with it or what have you? Because to live for 2 weeks, it would have had to have eaten.
Well,
right?
it actually,
of life.
I mentioned that regarding Colonel Magruder, that his information after April of 48. So in other words, it was almost a year later. That lived just a few weeks thereafter.
So how long was it actually alive then?
So it would have taken it right up till May. So that's almost a year. That's almost a year.
So there is proof then somewhere within the those who investigated this or were involved in that, they know what they eat, what they drink, what they need to survive. So there's a lot of knowledge that comes with that.
There would have been every effort to communicate.
Yeah.
But obviously, they were able to sustain it for all that time. And they certainly had other remains that they would have been able to autopsy and analyze. So the survivor, I have no doubt they would have made every effort. And as we all know, even with people that claim abduction, missing time experiences, interaction, and the idea that the communication is telepathic.
Yeah.
And I think, Tom, you had
a little bit of that.
Sure, right. And that would make sense that it would be like just a thought projection.
So the thought that the survivor was it didn't appear to be have a mean intent or anything, right? It was kind of soft. You said it was kind of like meek and
childlike. We had numerous witnesses say that they were like children.
So do you think it was because this entity was depressed or knew that he was in trouble? Or do you think that played a part? Or do you think it was just the nature of, I guess what I'm trying to say is, did it really have a personality? Was it being affected by what was happening around it? Or do you think this was the way that, the entities are in just an everyday setting? Or do you think it was a part of what it was going through and knowing it was going to die?
That's a good question, Tom. And I'm happy you brought it up, because I had mentioned Colonel Magruder, and he mentioned to his sons that he pitied this being.
Right.
His heart went out to it, that he sensed its sadness, its level of distress.
So it has a soul.
Well, or at least there is emotion to that capacity. And then at the very crash site, the one of the firemen, he was a fire crew chief by the name of Dan Dwyer, and he and another fireman by the name of Ed Reeves, they drove out in one of their cars, and they arrived at the impact site just before the military did. And Dwyer told his family about catching something out of the corner of his eye and then seeing this creature stumbling, trying to make its way towards them, and that he had impressions within his mind that there's nothing more that anyone can do. I've lost all my comrades, that type of thing. And my mission, is a failure. So that's what Dwyer, conveyed to his family. That was the mental, impression that he received.
Was there any? Sorry.
Did they ever find out what the mission was that he failed at?
Another good question. I often point out when just describing the history of the area of New Mexico, I find it amusing that whenever I lecture on college campuses, that especially with the faculty present and giving them a little history lesson, I'll ask the question, now, where was the first atomic bomb detonated? You'd be surprised how many of the members of the academia go, well, Japan, of course, Japan. No, how about 2 hours west of Roswell?
New Mexico, yeah.
And then you had ongoing atomic research at Los Alamos, just northwest of Albuquerque, and at the White Sands Proving Ground, north of Alamogordo. You had all the testing at the captured German V-2 rockets after World War II. And then, as we mentioned a moment ago, at Roswell, you had the Roswell Army Airfield, headquarters of the first atomic bomb squadron in the world. Now, Project Blue Book, which my scientific director, Dr. Jalen Hynek, was a scientific consultant to, the most famous of the three official UFO investigations, also determined that there were more UFO sightings in New Mexico than anywhere else in the country at that time. So for me, there are two things that one could serve as a possible objective on the part of this intelligence from off the planet. That first flash at Trinity site, that first atomic bomb detonation, that's intelligence signal is still traveling out through our Milky Way galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
It's still serving as an intelligent beacon to us here on planet Earth. Okay? So that serves as a signal. And then the second thing being, New Mexico was the hotbed of all military research at that time. So what you obviously have is someone who was very curious about our military potential back in 47. And what better place than New Mexico?
So that's what their mission was, to scope out our military capabilities.
And if we were going to become a threat off the planet.
Right.
And if we were going to poison our own planet, because everything that's been brought here could die without, water and food and that sort of thing. So if you're wiping out a whole section of a state, if you will, that eliminates, that adds a toxicity to the area.
Well, one of the things that in working with and interviewing many of the people involved with the 509 bomb squadron, mm-hmm. and then for having talked to people who flew with Paul Tibbets on Enola Gay, and you had Colonel Chuck Sweeney on Boxcar, the second atomic bomb. And then John Custer Mellon, who was an authority not only on the 509 bomb group, but also on the Manhattan Project. And one of the things you quickly learn was that they had a most nonchalant attitude towards this new, this new super weapon, that they were sending ground troops in to ground zero within minutes after the detonation. And they were flying aircraft through the mushroom clouds, not to see the effect on the pilots and the crew, but on the instruments, on the aircraft. So we were all expendable in that regard. So they had this very laissez-faire approach to atomic weaponry. In fact, they were looking into launchers like bazookas that could actually launch nuclear warheads. And they were flying a nuclear reactor back and forth from Roswell to Fort Worth, Texas, with the hope that they eventually would be able to have atomic-powered aircraft. Well, they abandoned that after they realized they would have quite a catastrophe on hand the first time one would crash. And then they had many mishaps with bombs falling out of bomb bays, and fortunately things didn't end. But the point being, and you both raise a good question, in that how we then went into this race with the Soviet Union and who was going to come up with the biggest stick, the biggest bomb. So we were experimenting. We were detonating bombs to the point of hundreds of atomic bomb detonations throughout the next 10, 25 years. And you can just imagine an intelligence off the planet thinking at some point that planet is going to not only self-destruct, but it's going to be uninhabitable.
Right.
And do we want to even be in the neighborhood? Do we even then want to take the chance of being there? And so I think in many respects, they behaved exactly as we would upon confronting another inhabitants on another planet. You first check to see if they have a greater defense mechanism than you do. And I'd like to believe when we've had many situations involving nuclear facilities where they clearly have demonstrated they could shut us down, in a matter of minutes. They can just disable our missiles. They can, disable missiles in flight.
Right. But you really got to be careful around nuclear power plants. They start shutting those down to cooling mechanisms. We're going to explode anyway. Right.
But maybe that's one of the reasons
they could for a little bit. But then what? Just think of what could happen due to that.
But yet, as we all know, that situation hasn't happened. Or maybe it happened at one time. It happened as far as that Indian Head nuclear power plant in upstate New York when you had the Great Northeastern Blackout in the late 60s. And that might have been one time where they just made such a show of power that, we could shut down the whole grid. We can make sure you're not able to launch a single missile. We're going to, we'll show you just exactly what power we do possess.
Right. I think an entire New England area lost power.
That's correct.
Right.
That is definitely correct. Yes.
I know a lot of people are thinking that they're going to stop us from firing missiles in the case of a nuclear
bomb. The hope is that, yes, Tim. The hope is that if it should ever get to that point, that they'll intercede. They will shut us down. Right.
Good.
If we accept that no matter what the origins, the source of the phenomenon, if we're dealing with time travelers, either they managed to evacuate the planet before it self-destructed, or we did make it. We did survive into the next century or two, that type of thing. Or if it's a parallel universe, or if we are truly dealing with biological beings from another planet that are traveling from A to B, whether they're using wormholes or, even twisting and manipulating time, time and travel, that type of thing. But nonetheless, that they also would have the power to intercede. to intervene, to step in.
That will.
And I know a lot of people are hoping that that would be exactly the case.
I do know that some people are making the case that they are not here to intercede, based on the fact that they didn't intercede in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korean War, all of that. They just stood by and observed.
Well, do we actually know that's not true, or that is true? How do we really know if they did or not?
Yeah, we don't know.
It never got out of control. And I don't think if we ever do have a war again, it's going to be nuclear, right? I mean, we're not. It would be more viral, I think, virus or something. I can't see us, because that would just be the end of it all. They'd have to get here in a hurry.
So they still indifferently stayed on the sidelines as millions of people were slaughtered, were exterminated, died.
That's my point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
We don't know. I mean, it would be hard pressed. Any one of us would be. It would be very, very difficult to determine whether there has been any interference, any interloping, any involvement in earthly affairs, so to speak. I think our good friend, the late Stanton Friedman, often suggested that just imagine you're an intelligence off the planet and you're monitoring our daily TV and radio broadcasts. And what's the predominant theme that comes across day in and day out? That we're a barbaric race, species, that our primary activity is tribal warfare, that we don't get along from country to country. We don't get along within our communities. We don't get along even within our families.
Barbaric.
If we're going to land on the White House front lawn and say, take us to your leader, we come in peace. And what would be our first reaction? We shoot. We shoot first.
Yeah.
Or, as you mentioned, Tim, and I myself have often commented that very often the phenomenon appears indifferent.
Right.
So they're here in spite of us. Or, as Carl Jung or even the late John Keel suggested, that maybe planet Earth is the universal insane asylum. All the crazies are here. Or we're the galactic zoo. They just stop by, for entertainment. And they're happy they're not like us, because we're hardly demonstrating our maturity and our civilized prowess in maintaining, this planet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Or perhaps we're a lab experiment.
Or a lab experiment. And it's failing. It's not.
I've always said that Earth is our galaxy's arc. I mean, we have, after 8 or 5 extinctions, I should say, global extinctions, that we have, 8 million species here thriving. And there would have had to have been groups of these, animals, if you will. Otherwise, everything would have been inbred and died off anyway. So it's almost like Earth was stocked. And so if you wanted to mine, or you wanted to create a new species, or tamper with DNA, let's say, we've got jellyfish can, become young again. Dogs have incredible senses. So if you were able to tweak and use the animals here, like Tim was alluding to, almost like a lab, but at the same time, we have all these species here that I think were brought here. So if we blow ourselves up, hypothetically, let's say, which it's not going to happen, but if that were to happen, I guess it could happen. But our planet can become extinct. Let's say a meteor hits our planet, or something that happens catastrophic again. They lose everything that they've now collected here.
Right.
And so if they are trying to build a different species, like an ant can carry, 100 times its weight. So a 6-foot ant could carry a Volvo across the street. So if they're looking for worker type, insects, if you will, or a species, like Tim said, this could be, this is important to them, is my point. Earth is important for more than we have tainted water. We ruin food. Everything that they've worked for dies.
And as you mentioned, Tom, we quite obviously are important to them.
Yes.
In that they have been gracing our planet for centuries. And one thing we failed to mention, if we should consider, and I am far from an expert, though one of the first people that got me very interested in the subject was Eric von Däniken and his first book, Chariots of the Gods. And the idea that if we accept the phenomenon today, we have to accept that it may have been here for many centuries. And if that should be the case, that at times there was a cooperation, an interaction, that we had a learning curve, that we were provided with technology, we were provided with the means to advance to the next level.
To see where how we would treat it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And we didn't handle it responsibly.
And I think much of it had to do with the fact that we were not globalists back then. We weren't out to conquer the world, and we didn't have the means. We didn't have the weaponry that we would have been a threat to the planet. Whereas today, and certainly since 1945, with that first atomic bomb, for the first time, we have the capability of destroying ourselves. And that may have been the reason that there was a much more direct interaction back then.
I agree.
We were very infantile. We were very primitive. We were very virgin-like, very untainted in our very approach to exist. We didn't even have a concept of being on a planet, let alone that there may be other people living on the other side, for that matter, across the Dead Sea. That type.
Our way to even get off our planet.
Right. So we have a level of innocence that they may have given us a little push, and through all these centuries later, that push has now become where we're pushing against one another.
Right.
And it becomes a case of, do they once again intercede and reel us back in and say, wait a minute, you're now threatening the very, very existence of the planet, or do they just let it happen and start all over? Failed experiment, I certainly, we all hope you're absolutely correct, Tom. But I'm just laying this out on the table right now because let me ask a question, Tom. When you had your experiences, did you feel as though not only that you were among brothers, you were among people that were here to help, they were benevolent in their very approach, or were they again indifferent? Were they very methodical in that they had a mission, they had a purpose, a reason, and you help them fulfill, that assignment, and then they move on to the next?
As I've said for a long time, the off-world experience that we were involved with wasn't what was so troubling. It was the on-world, after effect from people that treated us a certain way, and what made life very difficult for us, the mocking, the picking on my mother, that kind of thing. But to get to from what I remember, I was very young, but I was not scared. A lot of people say I was terrified of this, I'm scared of this. I was not scared at all. Maybe because I was young, and that craft might have symbolized didn't hit me in the way that it did maybe somebody older and more mature that might have understood what that could mean. For me, it was just kind of it was extraordinary, and I've said it was almost a privilege to see that and be part of that. So for that, I was more in awe. And then as far as what I remember, those moments, that experience I had, I don't ever really remember being scared. I just remember worrying about where my mother was. Why am I here? That kind of thing, like you would if I went to a house and everybody left. I mean, it wasn't as if I felt like I was in danger, that kind of thing. So I was just became part of something. I was more, frightened because I didn't
understand
what was happening or why this was happening. But no, I don't remember. There was a moment or two where I remember a little bit of pain here and there, but I don't know where that came from. But no, so I don't believe that the visitations we have is meant for harm. But then again, I believe there's different races here for a multitude of reasons, and perhaps we were lucky in that respect. Who knows?
That happened to be the particular race that you.
Right, because I hear a lot of different things, and I listen. to people, and I understand that not everybody's experience is going to, couple somebody else.
See, Tom, you're also describing what I have heard countless times from specifically the military witnesses at Roswell. And we had talked about this earlier, in that there was nothing threatening. They didn't feel that as though there was anything to be afraid of, except that there was a fear that they were handling contaminated material. Because they recognized for what it was, that and specifically the men who were part of the recovery operation. And they were spooked by it because it was that advanced. They realized that this was something off the planet, and as a result, they didn't know if they would later suffer from it. They didn't know if they would even live to see another morrow, for that matter. But again, dealing with the survivor, dealing with the one thing that, would have left them with the longest lasting impression. I've yet to have any one of the witnesses describe that they were fearful or felt threatened by it. And again, that's why I use the term that it was almost childlike, a level of innocence that they also, they sympathized with. They felt they could feel the pain of the fact that they crashed, he lost all his comrades,
right,
and this was his fate.
Is there any evidence that the bodies are still at Wright Pat?
From all accounts, Tim, and we had a former deputy commander at Wright Pat, Fulbert Colonel, told us that pretty much everything was shipped out by the early 1980s. And his explanation was that, as he put it, we had a damn of a time bringing things onto the base as well as shipping, because we're in the middle of Dayton, Ohio. We're in the heart of the city.
Right.
And, it's a simple summation when you consider like the Southwest, and with all the mountains and the open desert and the multi-levels, I mean, it's totally obscured. And so I tend to accept his description of it becoming more and more of an obstacle in maintaining that level of secrecy. And we have to keep in mind, too, that Area 51 did not even exist back in 1947. It wasn't until 1955 that the facility even originated. So for those who suggest, well, everything went to 51, 51 wasn't even in the picture. But I can tell you both that whenever I'm asked today, where's the wreckage? And I will honestly state that I don't believe the government / military is even in possession of this wreckage any longer. As we all know, the government / military doesn't manufacture anything. Not a single ship, plane, tank, rifle. It's all assimilated and it's all bid out to the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
Through the years, we've had first-hand witnesses at Boeing, at Lockheed, at Patel Institute, at Rand Corporation, at Hughes Aircraft, at General Electric, at Los Alamos, at Bureau of Standards, all describing receiving the wreckage from Roswell with the assignment, find the on button. How does this stuff work? And can we reverse engineer any of this technology? Mm-hmm. And for me, that's always been, a sample, an example of human arrogance. The idea that we can quantum leap the technology and just jump like Will Smith in Independence Day, jump in the cockpit and fly that thing like,
Not a manual.
Yeah, like we've done it, 100 times before. Sorry, get off your high horse. Human beings, we're not there. We're a far cry from this technology. And so the idea that the government has just buried this for all these decades, no. They did assimilate it into the private sector with the hope that somebody would finally break the code.
Yeah.
And so that's why I the people I work with, my partner Tom Carey, for example, we're convinced that the government/military lost control of it many years ago. And the old order didn't pass it down to the new. I would say most of the high-ranking officers back in 1947, they took the truth with them. They died with it. And as a result, they lost chain of custody many years ago. And so that's where we're convinced it all lies within the hands of the private sector. We remember Eisenhower talking about and warning us about the military-industrial complex. And I think that's one of the things he was warning us about, that they were taking over. And that was back in 1961. So 60 years ago, he was warning us about this. Well, I'm here to tell you this evening on your show that that's exactly what happened. And they're the ones who are in possession of all the physical evidence.
Now, including the bodies.
Including the body. Well, okay, we have 3 first-hand witnesses from the Biological Medical Research Facility, which happens to be in Dugway, Utah.
Okay,
And
yeah.
Yes, and the fact that we have 3 high-ranking first-hand, who all 3 told us Dugway. I can accept that the bodies are cryogenically, because you wouldn't be sending them out into the private sector. Biological remains are tested, dissected, autopsy, and that's the end of it.
Right.
You only are able to glean so much knowledge from the biology and nothing more. The physiological, make up the DNA, and beyond that,
freeze it. Just freeze it.
Just freeze them. Just preserve unique specimens.
Right.
And so they would never have released.
Would need to.
Bodies into the private sector. Just freeze them, as you said, Tom.
So, if I may, a question for you. So, if what we're alluding to right now is that this private sector got in touch, got their hands on all this material, and so here we are now jumping about 10, 15 years ahead. We've got the space race. Now we're comfortable that possibly we can use this information to beat Russia to space. Right. And that's when all this funding went to NASA. And a lot of people don't realize that NASA used to be in Boston, across from MIT back in the day. NASA was where you had Command Aerospace, Sikorsky, GE, what you were alluding to earlier, Pratt & Whitney, Sprague Electric, which made the goodwill message that was left on the moon. All that was in New England. And here we are now. We got all these companies making capacitors, and all this stuff just exploded. And we actually did beat Russia to space, to the moon, right?
Well, to the moon. We didn't beat them into space because they beat us with SCHMITT.
But to the moon, yeah. So,
and how many people are aware that the very head of the Apollo program, the race to the moon,
right,
was Nazi German rocket scientist Werner von Braun.
Yeah,
he was
I knew that. Yeah.
That were brought here all with Operation Paperclip, where we grabbed as many Nazi scientists as we could. And one of the things that we've also been working on in the last number of years, we've been proving, because we've been finding families, we've been talking to their last doctors, that the Paperclip scientists were brought over from Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. They were brought over to Roswell to examine the wreckage. So they risked bringing the Nazi scientists to Roswell at the time to see if they had any ideas as to, they wanted to at least check. Were the Germans working on anything like this that we didn't know about? Because we know the Germans were highly advanced. They were way beyond, both United States, Japan, Russia at that time. And so they took, the opportunity of Roswell to bring Paperclip into that situation. So again, it continues to raise the relevance. The fact that you're certainly not going to do that with a weather balloon.
Right.
Hey, being that you speak so much about the Roswell incident, have you ever had the question, I'm sure you have, that did Russia ever have an experience of this magnitude prior to 1940?
Not prior to. We've heard, and I've lectured in Moscow. I had dinner one evening with even two of the cosmonauts, and I was given a private tour of the Space Museum in Moscow. And they had seriously talked to me at that time about creating a Roswell exhibit at the Space Museum in Moscow, of all things. And I kept coming back to all the talk about a Russian Roswell.
Right.
And I'm here this evening to tell you that I have good reason to believe, based on our conversations, and we've heard this from other colleagues in Russia since then, that indeed there have been numerous recoveries on Soviet Russia. And first of all, because you're talking about the largest landmass, the largest country in the world, and so there would have been ample opportunity for such mishaps. And so the other thing, in 1988, just before we started our Roswell investigation, our own independent investigation on Roswell, Pravda, the state-run newspaper in Moscow, released a report that they found documents. They uncovered documents that immediately after the Roswell incident, that on Tuesday, July 8th, when the Roswell Army Airfield actually put out that press release, that they had actually captured a flying saucer. And 5 hours later, it's explained the way is nothing more than a weather balloon device with a radar reflector kite. Well, according to Pravda, President Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union at that time didn't believe that. He thought that this had to be another smokescreen for the atomic bomb. That 2 years before, Russia was shocked when we, unveiled, that new super bomb. And the Soviet Union wouldn't detonate their own first bomb until August of 49. So we had a 4-year jump on them. 4 years. That still took them to detonate their own bomb. But Stalin felt that the weather balloon explanation at Roswell was another cover story for something else. And he immediately requested that his men in the field would do an investigation and provide him as far as with their assessment. Well, Pravda then reported that based on interviews of some of the former KGB officers who were involved, that the report to Stalin was that it was not of American design, whatever it was. It wasn't American. And it did not appear to be of an immediate threat. But they recommended a top priority investigation by the Soviet Academy of Science. And then it listed all those scientists who were to report back to Stalin by the end of that year. Now, would we love to see what their final, determination was on Roswell? But lest any of your listeners or viewers believe that, well, maybe it was Russian. Well, Russia was half destroyed by Nazi Germany at that time. They were still crawling back as far as from the ruinization that they faced during World War II.
Yeah.
China was a third world country that, I'm sorry, they barely had cars in China at that time. So if it wasn't American, then whose was it? And I can't emphasize enough that when that ranch foreman, W.W. Brazo, first reported the debris, nothing had been reported missing. There was nothing being tested at that time. It was a 4th of July weekend. Most of the officers, most of the personnel were home on leave. And so if they are not on alert for any downed aircraft or any tests that have gone awry, off course, that type of thing, if it's not ours, then whose is it? What does this represent? What does this technology represent?
And if it was ours or Germany's or whoever, just throwing it out there, then we would have already known, because we still had radar back then. We would have known it's in the area, and we would have had planes, and we would have had people waiting for it.
Exactly.
It was
Exactly.
like such a surprise, right?
Exactly. We would have, because as Tom knows, and I don't know if you've ever been to New Mexico, Tim, but the high desert, it's all open desert. It's unchanged in 1,000 years.
Right.
And the idea that where this debris was deposited. Now, mind you, the crash takes place late evening of July 2nd. The rancher doesn't report it for 4 more days. Sunday, July 6th. That wreckage is still out there. If we were missing anything, if we were testing anything, aerial reconnaissance would have found it within hours. It's totally unobscured in the open desert. And it covers an area of 1 mile long. So for anyone to suggest, well, maybe it was ours and it just took us that long to find it. Again, you're demonstrating your ignorance. You don't know the territory. You don't know how quickly the military would have had aircraft in the air securing the wreckage if it was something top secret, something that sensitive, that they would have made sure that it never would have fallen into the hands of any civilians.
And there were 2 crash sites, correct?
Correct. There was a debris field and an impact site, much closer to Roswell, where the remains of the craft and the bodies and the survivor were located.
So hypothetically, the bodies would have been there for 5 days with no water, no food, right? Because it took that long.
Correct. So that all
unless they had food on board.
And it was a pod, Tim. The remains of the craft, it was about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, as described, egg-shaped, and so it would have been most likely the cabin, the cockpit of the craft. And whether through the explosion, the malfunction, that it was jettisoned like an escape pod from the explosion, and then impacting about 25 miles from the debris field, about 35 miles north of Roswell. And that's where, again, the remains of the crew and the lone survivor were recovered.
Now, what about this material that everyone's pretty much heard about this, unless you've lived under a rock, that was very lightweight, and was it in sheets? Was it in squares? The shape of the material itself, I've gotten very good ideas what it looked like and how it felt and the mechanics of it. But how much of it was actually found? And was it windy? Because that material could have blown around, correct? It could have blown quite some distance. Yep.
I just need to drink something.
Not at all. I got a scratchy throat myself. Yeah.
Well,
so I guess my question is that material is very light and thin, and I don't know how much of it they found, but was it possible that a lot of it would be out there?
You make a good point, Tom, in that for as often as we get out to the debris field, and I've led 5 archaeological digs to the debris field, where we're still looking for a piece of the Holy Grail, as we call it, piece of the memory material. Mm-hmm. Having the eyewitnesses describe the extent of the debris field.
Right.
It covered an area, as I said earlier, of almost 1 mile long. That's a tremendous amount of wreckage.
Yeah.
There was one large piece, about 10 foot wide, that
material, the light stuff?
Of the material, right. That the ranch foreman, Brazo, dragged behind his pickup truck.
Wow. I didn't hear about that.
In a livestock shed. He dragged it there that very first day, the end of that day. And in fact, even in the press release that the Roswell Army Airfield put out, it states that the rancher stored it in a livestock shed before it was picked up by the Army.
I can see that. Oh, they found it though.
But it was that large piece, and it created a long furrow, a gouge that was a few hundred feet long, 10 foot wide, a few inches deep. So that was the largest piece.
Oh, it's 2 inches thick, this stuff as well?
No, the gouge.
Oh, okay.
Into the ground, right. Now, The livestock shed was still there until about 15 years ago, about 3 miles to the north of the actual debris field location. Now, the rest of the field was covered with a lot of pieces that were about handkerchief sized, but most of it maybe the size of the palm of your hand, even smaller. I-beams with the symbology that ran the length of each piece, silken strands of material like microfilament fishing line, and the witnesses described how you could hold a light up to one end and the light would emit out the opposing end. Well, they're describing fiber optics back in 1947. Yet fiber optics didn't come into vogue until around 1970. And then you had the sheets of material that were paper thin, weightless in your hands. Engineers at the base describe how they took a 16-pound sledgehammer. And I joke, like, the next time you're in a Home Depot, pick up a 16-pound hammer. You know, it'll go through your car like tissue paper. And yet the engineers at the base describe that no matter how often they would strike, they would pound on this wreckage, it wouldn't even scratch it. And then the memory material, the same weightless, nearly indestructible material. But this you could crumble, you could crease, you could fold. And yet every time you placed it down, it would flow like water. It would unravel and just smooth right out. And so that's the type of material that we continue to hunt for, because it would explain this all overnight. Just imagine, both of you, if we could have a press conference and we have a piece of the actual memory material in front of a room full of reporters, and just by just demonstrating that no matter what you did to it, it always returned back to its original shape and size. And yet a bullet wouldn't even penetrate it.
I do have a question. Why would the ship disintegrate
Right.
if the material was nigh indestructible?
Nearly indestructible. That's why I use the word nearly.
That's why I was going to say, if it was that durable,
right,
it had to be something major
yes,
that made them crash.
Totally catastrophic. Whether it was an internal malfunction, but whatever, it reached their fracture point. Just think back to our materials back in 1947. If we say they're, at this level back then, would we all agree that in 2022 our materials maybe now are at this level? We keep improving on that theme. We keep getting better and better. The point being, if anything that's manufactured, it has to be malleable at a certain point. If you can assemble it, you can also disassemble it. And the point being that our fracture point today might be at this level. Theirs may still be, 2 feet above that level as a comparison. But whatever happened, it reached that level of stress. It reached that breaking point.
It had to have, yeah.
And it reached that fracture point, and so it broke up.
Unless,
go ahead, Tom. Go ahead.
So,
go ahead.
All right. So, with regard to the wreckage and the material, obviously, if it's unbreakable and it was able to break apart, then something exceeded that stress point. However, were the pieces that were found, did they look like they were fabricated in a certain way, or they just actually look?
Oh, yes. You had asked that earlier. Were they squares? Were they
circle? Whatever, yeah.
Like even Major Marcel of Intelligence, who was first sent out to investigate this, and even on his way back off the base at that time in Roswell, right within the city. And at 2:00 in the morning, he wakes up his wife, Viad, and his son, their only son, Jesse Jr., who would go on to become doctor. He was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. He was a full-bird colonel in the Air National Guard. He even served 2 tours in the war in Iraq at the age of 69 and 70, if you can imagine that, as a flight surgeon. Well, anyway, Marcel described that it looked as though something had torn it up. It was shredded. And that's why the edges were jagged. They were not able to even reassemble. Even in the kitchen where he had the debris scattered, they attempted to put together some of the pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. And they were never able to do that. They couldn't find any commonality or any common edges or borders. And so it was quite catastrophic, whatever caused this to break up. Yes.
And a lot of the debris could have blown away then too. Like
yes, I failed to mention that. So it's an ongoing. It was always an ongoing joke with us, gentlemen, when we would be out at the debris field, that there's a prevailing wind at the site. It's high desert, and we always would joke we'd be better off looking in western Texas for the wreckage than at the location in Lincoln County, New Mexico.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to ask you something about something that's very important that's coming up on Tuesday, the 17th. What do you think about the House of Representatives Intelligence Committee UAP public hearing? What is your perspective on that?
Unless, and we have been preaching and we have been pounding this drumbeat since December of 2017 with the New York Times article, that unless they subpoena and grant immunity to whistleblowers, people within the military who have been silenced, who have been threatened into submission for loss of pension, loss of rank, even forfeiture of benefits and imprisonment, that if these men aren't, and women, aren't afforded an opportunity to testify without fear of reprisal and describe their own personal experiences, we're not going to hear anything new. You have two spokespeople from the Pentagon who most likely, in a need-to-know capacity, know nothing about this subject. It's one of the things that I often tell people in the press. Whenever you speak to anyone, either in the military or in the government, realize that these people are highly compartmentalized. They only know that which they have access to. The difference that Tim, Tom, and I have is we can come at this from any direction.
Correct.
We're not being restricted. We can investigate this from every possible angle. And one of the things the military has a long track record of is that they typically will assign someone who has the least knowledge of the subject matter so they can't slip. They can't trip up. They can't make a mistake. And as a result, the two people who initially now who testify before the Senate Intel Committee, I will guarantee you they will only be able to speak that for which they have been informed, that for which they have been briefed, and nothing more. If you were to ask them about a single UFO case or a single UFO event or witness or a situation, they will have no prior knowledge whatsoever, because they're not going to take that chance. Because if they crack that Pandora's box even slightly, they'll never ever be able to put the genie back in. If they utter a single word suggesting that Roswell was something beyond the four explanations they have already provided, cat's out of the bag.
Right. So basically, they're trying to control the narrative. They're not really releasing new information to the public. They're controlling the narrative.
Exactly, Tim. And that's where Congress, who, as much as we pay their salary, well, they also allocate the military budget. And so they, pull their purse strings. And it's like, well, then we're going to grant immunity. We're going to subpoena our own witnesses. And you notice, both of you, who's been strangely quiet for the last 5 years in all this is the Air Force. The very arbiters of the cover-up since 1947 are the ones who have yet to be called on the carpet. We're relying on the Navy. We're relying as far as on people who heretofore, like even when Project Blue Book, those files were declassified in 1977. 13,000 cases they investigated. 701 remained unexplained. But where were the Navy cases? Where were the Army, Marine Corps, National Guard? You mean they weren't having UFO experiences? Every time there was a UFO experience in the military, it was always the Air Force? So that's where we have to keep the pressure on these elected officials. That's where the Senate Intel Committee has to get to the bottom of it. Otherwise, they're once again going to maintain the status quo. Oh, yes, we're investigating this. We're going to rely on the military to brief us on what they have been investigating. And it's going to be a repeat of Project Blue Book all over again.
Well, it's kind of like Project Sign. The estimate of the situation is the playbook that they're following. It's a national security threat, so we cannot release certain information because it's a threat to our restricted airspace and our pilots. So we're not going to tell the public because, we just don't want to do that.
National security, and that's always been a fallback with them. And you both acknowledge the fact that they only acknowledge the phenomenon back to 2004.
Right, they won't go back before that.
Because if they were to go back to 47, well, then all the questions of Roswell would come up. And then secondly, well, how could this possibly have been Russian or Chinese or any other country at that time when the United States was the lone superpower in the world at that time? And if it's a threat within the 2000s, you mean it wasn't a threat back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and thereafter? And so they're keeping it contained within a narrow window. So I'm also concerned that their fallback can still be Russian technology, Chinese technology, and that they can do if it's within, from 2004 to the present. They go back decades before, then it clearly has to be someone else's technology, and it's not Russian or Chinese.
Do you think that with all the privately funded SpaceX, and so forth, Bigelow Aerospace, that there's any pressure now on NASA to release this information before, let's say, Elon Musk decides to go public with something? Do you think that there is now, another space race, if you will, within the industry? Because at that point, if it does come out through, say, Elon Musk or SpaceX, then NASA's going to look foolish. And so now there's this point where and obviously the Air Force and Navy are not the groups that really have the information. They have some of it, but they're privately funded groups through black budgets or however. But at the same time, there must be some pressure for the government to release something before a privately funded organization does. I feel that way. I don't know how you feel about it, but what's your thoughts on that?
Well, you make an excellent point, Tom, in that though NASA is a mere shadow of its former self, and it has been for 50 years. Just imagine, and I know Richard Hoagland, we've had the discussion, that just imagine if the Apollo program would have continued unabated, and as much as the Kennedy administration, with the goal that we were going to land on the moon, we were going to have a manned mission to the moon by 1970. The plan thereafter was that we were going to have a manned mission to Mars by 1985. So here we are, 45 years or 40 years later, and what do we have to show for our space program?
Nothing.
So then the question is, have we had a secret space program all these years? Well, it wasn't NASA. Was it the military? Well, we know that the Pentagon, for example, was constantly leasing the shuttle for secret missions. We don't know what they were doing. Well, we suspect they were launching their own satellites as far as for laser and particle beam technology, that type of thing. They were setting up as far as that network, that triangulation, that we would have global coverage as far as that we could take out, as far as SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, that I was all part of that program. But to suggest that NASA would have ever been surpassed by the private sector, and here we are, that whether it's Richard Branson, and whether it's Bigelow Aerospace, and whether it's as far as Elon Musk, and NASA is just idly stepping back and going, boy, thank God they're taking over for us.
Yeah, but they're also funded by the U.S. government, so their lips are sealed.
Right. So, but yet they still are a civilian private corporation, NASA, albeit they're government sponsored, but nonetheless.
Aren't they more of a public front?
Yes, NASA. And that's the thing, Tim, that they become more of, and thankfully it's because of the private space program that now the pressure is on.
Right.
And now that China is talking about manned missions to Mars or to the moon, for example. And that Elon Musk is talking about actually colonizing Mars. And so I don't know that NASA will ever become what it once was. No. I personally, from NASA friends that I have, they feel fine. It takes the pressure off us that we don't have to ever engage in, long distance manned space programs any longer. And yet they'll be the first ones to say, well, we started it.
Yeah. And where's our funding?
So, so how do we reinstitute our funding?
Because we haven't proved or done anything in so long. They don't even deserve it at this point.
Just think of where we may be today if the programs would have continued over the last 50 years.
Or maybe they have, but they just haven't told us about it and they've kept it secret.
But it hasn't trickled down into the private sector. Yeah. Previously, and that was one of the things that NASA often used to build up their own budgetary requests, is look at all the spin-off technology, as far as flame retardant clothing, and as far as flame retardant blankets for babies, and freeze-dried foods, and computer technologies, and propulsion efforts, and electronics. And so they would say that most everything in people's homes have all spun off of space technology, that type of thing. We're not seeing that any longer. It's all from the private sector.
Somebody in the comment section, Jason Mardonio Mesa, said, according to William Tompkins, there were reptilians that stood by their crafts along the crater after the first landed Apollo mission on the moon. And I'm supposed to ask you about that.
Well, we know that numerous astronauts have made statements to the effect that we have visitors or we're not alone here, that type of thing. And we know because of the time delay that much of it certainly was edited out. And supposedly these stories even come from ham radio operators, people that were picking up the actual radio transmissions, that type of thing. We know that astronauts have had experiences. We know that Neil Armstrong, was actually quite interested in UFOs. And so, and Gordon Cooper, Buzz Aldrin.
Story.
Edgar Mitchell.
Yeah, Edgar Mitchell, certainly. Edgar Mitchell wrote the foreword to our Witness to Roswell book. And he certainly wouldn't have done that if he didn't endorse the book. He didn't support it in the book. Yeah, Curry Musgrave, certainly, yes, yeah. So it's as though they've either had experiences or just by being in space, they have a greater awareness that Earth is nothing more than just a little speck, third rock from the sun. And
right.
We should come again. We should get off of our arrogance and realize that we're just part of a one small galaxy of billions of galaxies. And to think that the lone inhabitants here, on planet Earth, only the debunkers, only the skeptics believe that.
Yeah. One of the things that I've always said is, since they're determining now that there are different dimensional realities and possible multiverses, if either one of those have planets and they have their own multiverses and their own different dimensions, then our concept or perception of the universe could be infinite.
Totally.
Even more so than what we thought of before. And that makes Earth even smaller yet.
Yes, absolutely. And nationalism is the name of the game here on planet Earth. We all owe our allegiance to our respective countries, our elected officials, that type of thing. And for the first time, we'd all have to concede we were nothing more than Earthlings. That we're all here on this, this spaceship Earth with a limited, source of sustenance, and we don't get along with one another. And we were talking earlier that, it would appear that many of our leaders are hell-bent on, destroying the planet for whatever agenda, whatever purpose. And so we would like to, for those of us who accept that we're dealing with a phenomenon, we're dealing with an existence, a technology off the planet. We like to believe at some point we will grow up, we will mature enough to become members of the galactic neighborhood, the Federation, as they would call it, like in the Star Trek, series.
Right.
But I'm afraid, even in biblical years, we haven't, we're just as barbaric as we were 5,000-6,000 years ago. That the only way,
even more so.
Yeah, the only way we settle problems is still.
Yeah. We just hide it better.
Yeah.
What I was going to say, when we were talking about infantile, that humans being infantile, I think we still are in regards to researching what's really going on. I mean, we're still looking at things in a very narrow point of view. I mean, most people won't even step out of the box of their normal daily lives to take a look at what's really going on behind the scenes. And that's a real frustration I have, because it's hard to get people to see the truth.
And the fact that we're dealing, as we were mentioning, we were describing the Senate Intel Committee, we certainly know they know next to nothing. I mean, every meeting, every discussion I have had with men and women on Capitol Hill, they know nothing about this subject. And then you have a mainstream media that falls into the same dilemma. They know nothing about this subject, yet they're the ones asking the questions. And then who do they typically go to for the answers? But not the investigators, not the historians, but, and in your case, Tom, I'm pleased that they do go to people who've had experiences. But more times than not, they go to people in the entertainment field. They go to people who film documentaries. They go to somebody who, writes a book.
Well, I've seen them interview you quite a bit too. So, but it's far and few between. And then it used to be the rolling of the eyes, the smirk or something, but they're getting more serious about it now. But you're right. It's almost like it's the flavor of the month, if you will. It's a hot topic. Let's talk about it. Let's get ratings up, but they really don't care.
Very cyclical. And then they just the 24-hour news cycle, then they move on to the next story.
Right.
So that's where it is incumbent on us, especially for the fact that it's the first time in 50 years that we have hearings in Washington. And even when we had them 50 years ago, they were just cursory. There were just a few statements. There was just a few days of asking questions, and then that was it. That was the extent of it. It was dropped like a hot potato, and the subject became totally taboo at that point.
Right.
We can't allow that to happen this time. we have a wonderful opportunity that if we step to the fore and say, there's a rich history that dates not back to 2004, but back to 47 in contemporary terms, and then we can document that it goes back centuries.
Right.
And that we have to be open-minded to the fact that if we're dealing with a phenomena in 2022, it existed also hundreds of years in the past. We can't just have a beginning where it first arrived and let's hope that it's one of ours, because the last thing we're going to acknowledge is that it's something off the planet. Well, that's what they're afraid of, that if they lose that earthly control, they'll never be able to reel it back in. They'll never be and again, we have to push for whistleblowers to be granted immunity, to step forward. We all know that there are dozens and dozens of high-ranking officers, retired generals, full-bird colonels, that if they would be called in to testify, they could describe some of the most profound cases of all time. We can't lose this chance.
I think part of the problem is they don't want to be caught in a lie. I mean, they've been lying for over 75 plus years, one lie after another to cover one lie and lie again and again, and they're afraid of being castigated in public. And I really believe that's the case. And not only that, they don't want to admit that they do not have control of our airspace.
That is also an excellent point, Tim. The idea that they'd have to concede that there are aircraft, there are devices that have total impunity within our own airspace and every sovereign airspace throughout the world. And as a result, they concede that there's something there. We don't know where they're from, who they are, what their intentions are. And then, trust us. The very arbiters of the cover-up for the last 75 years, now they're going to be transparent. Now they're going to fess up. They're going to reveal all. Well, sorry, that's where the government has to do their homework and say, no. We're going to call our own witnesses. We're going to call people in who you have been suppressing for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And we're going to give them a chance to finally state on the record what they observed, what they held in their very hands, what they know is not something made here on planet Earth.
Right. And also, knowledge is power. Power is money. So there's that aspect to it.
True.
And then you've got that if we did find something, let's say, and I'm sure we did back in the 40s, and we've never been able to back engineer anything, then now all of a sudden we look stupid. But like you said, it's gone to the private sector, right? So now they've lost control of where the material is. So they look foolish, and then they've got documents and they know they've got footage. I mean, even Caroline Corey, her new film, they got a lot of footage in 5 days. So our government's got to have a slew of footage. They know this is happening. They know it's true. It's like, well, we haven't been able to figure out a damn thing in all this time. So if we do come clean, now we're not only going to look like liars, but we're also going to look stupid. And then the other part of this too is, why are we waiting so desperately for the government to tell us the truth, when how many people out there truly trust the government to begin with?
Precisely.
Right.
So this whole thing is like this big circle, this Woodworld circle. And I'm like, does it really even matter if the government tells us anything? I would feel more comfortable if Bigelow Aerospace said, look what I've got. Just here it is.
And wouldn't that be wonderful? That even though Bigelow is contracted by NASA, he is contracted by the government.
Right? The space station.
Yeah. Right. That he would finally just say, this is bigger than all of us.
Yeah.
And that at the heart of the congressional hearings, that they would call their own press conference and say, well, now we're going to demonstrate the truth. We're going to show it to you. And what's Congress going to say at that point? Oh, you're undercutting us? You're trying to steal the narrative? You're trying to, steal away our smoke, that type of thing? Or it's like, well, no, you didn't call us in to testify, so we just thought we would create our own testimony. We create our own, situation where our witnesses could step forward and present the truth.
Right. That would really help.
And the other question is, why now? Why now? Is this a distraction, a diversion? World events. It's not like there was a Phoenix Lights situation with hundreds of witnesses, or there was a scramble and an aircraft, like a military fighter, came down during an encounter with a UFO, and the press was pushing for answers. And the other question, the dilemma that the military faces is the culpability. That, especially back in Roswell time, all the witnesses who were threatened, all the children who were told they would be killed if they ever talked about this again. And so there could be a tremendous, albeit, statute of limitations, but nonetheless, there could still be a class action suit where the families now would step forward and say, well, up until my father's deathbed just 2 years ago, he was still living in fear over this because you told him you would kill us all if he ever spoke about this.
That's a really good point.
So it's a lot more than just, it's the subject is so taboo that they're risking their careers if they ever speak out about this. No. There's again a history, and that's what they're not acknowledging. And that's where we have to keep pointing out that the best cases, the best incidents happened years ago, and they also need to have their day in court.
Well said.
Yes, I agree. Okay, one thing I want to show to everybody in the chat are some of his books. I do have some of them here. I have this one.
And that's in this particular book, Tim, we actually have for the first time eyewitness, all the descriptions of the impact site, the craft, the bodies at that second location. That's in this book, as well as I mentioned, artist, the Hollywood creator Mike Hill. We created the three-dimensional photograph of the survivor. So those are in the Ultimate Cold Case Closed book.
In this book here.
Correct.
Okay.
For the
And
first
then we got this book.
Right, which is the cover-up of how they managed to suppress the information from the media, how they shut down the media in Roswell, in New Mexico, throughout the country, throughout the world, what they did to the politicians up till today, what they did to their own military personnel, what they did to the civilians to silence them. So the cover-up, what they did to shut this down. And if you read that book and then come away and go, well, but it was just a balloon. Sorry, you don't threaten to kill children over a damn weather balloon. Give me another example where they've ever done that.
Right.
Yeah, you can't.
Then there's Witness to Roswell.
That's the most recent, as we started off the beginning of the show, the 75th anniversary edition. And this was originally the #1 selling UFO book in the world in 2007 and 2008.
Okay. And then there's this one. The Children of Roswell. Is that a book or is that something other?
No. That was also a book because the Children of Roswell book was well received. And as we were interviewing more and more of the witnesses, we realized that their spouses, their children had involvement. They had their own, stories to tell. So we went back to them. And we found that not only the emotion, the depth of, human experience for dealing with something extraordinary. And what clearly came across, gentlemen, is that whether these were civilian families or military families, that they all reacted the same way. They behaved as though this was something extraordinary. And so this was our way of also providing the families with closure, that they also had, an experience that was beyond, the human experience. And there are just many wonderful, heartwarming stories in that particular book. I'm very proud of that book, Children of Roswell.
I'm going to read that book. I'd never seen that book before until today, so I will read that one. Yeah. Okay, Tom. Any last words?
Last question.
Tom always has last words. Come on, Tom.
Yeah, I've always got something to say. You know me, Don. Okay, so with respect to the weather balloon idea or theory,
Project Vogel.
This is something I've always thought about, and I didn't want to take up too much time today on it, but since we mentioned it again, weather balloons, first of all, are owned by someone. Correct. And they're in place to report on the weather. So you have to know where the weather balloon is so that you can calculate or correlate that weather condition where it is. So when the weather balloon went down, if in fact it went down, then somebody would have known immediately that the weather balloon went down. So somebody owned that weather balloon. So if it was a weather balloon and that took place, then there would be no justification for the amount of government and the amount of money that was spent for all these troops to go into Roswell and then even buy caskets the size for children.
Of course. Of course.
The weather balloon, did anyone ever ask whose weather balloon it supposedly was?
Oh, yes. We know exactly.
The last time it left a signal to the whoever was utilizing or had leased it at that point, or who owned it at that point.
Well, do either of you know where the weather balloon that was photographed at Fort Worth at the balloon press conference with Major Marcel and General Roger Ramey and his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas DeBose, and weather officer Irving Newton, and those pictures that went around the world at that time, Marcel holding up sheets of the radar kite.
Yes.
Do you know where that balloon is?
I actually got a picture of that.
Do we know where that balloon came from? Yes. Now look at it. Neoprene rubber, reflective foil, wooden sticks, string, and tape.
A 5-year-old could tell you that's not
off-the-shelf material that a child would recognize. And here, the very people in charge of the atomic bomb had never seen anything like this before. Now, you know where the balloon came from? It came from Roswell. Because these very balloons were launched twice a day from atop the bank building in downtown Roswell in conjunction with the bomb drop exercises that the 509 bomb group was doing every day.
Right, so they knew what to identify.
There's a picture in the base yearbook of the balloons even hanging from the rafters before they were deployed.
Let me ask you this. Did anybody ever claim through insurance the loss of that balloon?
Well, these were these were military sanctioned. These were balloons that were used by the military.
Everything's still insured, right?
Right. But they would deploy them, and they were high altitude with a sonobuoy, and so that they would remain as far as stationary as possible, that you could provide upper wind speed, upper wind direction, temperature, that type of thing. Because again, it was to provide the pilots and crew, the navigators of the B-29s, the information they needed in conducting the dropping tests of the sand barrels that they used in place of the actual bomb casing. So they were using the equivalent size and weight of sand barrels. So to suggest again that the very people who knew these particular balloons better than anyone were then used to be part of that cover-up.
Yeah,
that's the irony in all this. That Major Marcel, who's in two of the pictures, ordered to pose with the balloon. He knew them better than anyone, and yet he was the patsy. He was the fall guy.
Really shows the malintent of some divisions of the government, or how we're all striving to get the truth from them. They haven't been truthful with us since I can remember.
Yeah. World War II would be a primary example of just how many atrocities were covered up by our own military. I mean, war has a way of just bringing out the worst in officers, not the enlisted men. The enlisted men are following orders. They're doing what they're told to do at the risk of court-martial.
Yeah,
right. But the point is, it's the officers who sit back, and they're the ones who also call the shots at Roswell. And unfortunately, the people such as Major Marcel, that look on his face, and then he's told to just be a good soldier. It's all going to come out in a few years. You'll be vindicated, Jess. The truth will come out. And it's 30 years later, and he's diagnosed with terminal emphysema. And he realizes they're never coming out. So he comes out. He goes public.
Yeah, good for him.
That's why we know about Roswell today, because of people like Jesse Marcel, who broke their oath of silence and told the world the truth. And the military and the press has still been running interference about this. And I, for one, am going to be damned if I'm going to let these hearings in Washington not allow Roswell also to come to the fore and also be part of these hearings.
Right. I agree. I hope that the hearings on Tuesday are not just another cursory example of how the government handles it. Because I have to say that the UFO report from last year on the 25th of June was like a fifth grade book report. It was disappointing at best.
It was a joke. It was like, again, they were playing us for fools. And I'm sorry, that's what they do. That's their business. And I'm not anti-military as much as the military is a dictatorship. And they look at civilians as obstacles. They look at civilians as someone, we need to get them out of the way whenever we do anything military.
Right. When I was in the service, they taught us to believe that civilians were worthless and that military people were omnipotent. So that is their viewpoint. And even though we treasure our military and all our vets, and I want to say that we do support all our veterans.
Of course we do. Absolutely.
It's just that the ideology behind, the doctrine behind the military is what is inhibiting the release of a lot of information. Also, the NDAs are also restricting the flow of information. The problem with NDAs is that they're so restrictive that we cannot ease their amount of time that they're attached to someone.
Correct.
If they could do that, we could possibly get some information from people before they're on their deathbed, and that would be interesting to know.
I'm going to mention quickly, we brought him up a number of times, and that was the rancher, Mac Brazel, W.W. Brazel, who first reported the incident.
Right.
And this was after the balloon press conference that he's grabbed by the military. Now, again, the military has absolutely no authority over civilians unless martial law be declared.
Right.
There was martial law declared at Roswell. That would have certainly elevated this to a higher level. They had to play it down. But nonetheless, they kidnapped him. They held him at the base for 5 full days. They deprived him of food, of water. They kept him up all hours of the night. They asked him the same questions over and over again. They did not afford him due process to even call his boss to let him know, I'm not at the ranch. You better get somebody there to maintain things. And not even call his wife to let her know where he was. But here's the biggest thing. And I want, again, all your viewers to also question this. Because he kept talking about the indignity, what they did to him. They subjected him to a full Army physical in his detainment. And they also subjected him to a full body cavity search. Now, does anyone watching this evening think they were looking for pieces of a weather balloon?
No.
And I defy any skeptic, any debunker to say they were.
Right. They usually keep that type of procedure for criminals within the military system.
And they're own. And they are military.
Right, military, not civilians. No.
Not civilian.
I don't think they have any jurisdiction over civilians. It's
none whatsoever, unless martial law.
Civilians are under a judicial system on the outside. Military is under the military code of military uniform code of military justice system governs military people. So that would apply only to military people. So that was incredibly wrong, and they should not have been able to do it. But how many times have we seen our government do things that go against the laws and the policies of this land?
Because they write the laws. They write the laws that protect them and incriminate us.
Do as I say, not as I do.
We get set up. We get framed. We get entrapped. To just imagine, we just so much as say a single lie to the FBI, and we can wind up in prison for 10 years. But they make a policy. They make a business of it. And the FBI has been caught in many a lie regarding their own investigation of UFOs through the years.
Right.
And no one will hold them responsible. Let's see if Congress calls any FBI officials in. We want to see your files on the UAPs. I doubt it. But we need to twist their arms, and maybe it's like, oh, we didn't think of that. Maybe we'll call the FBI, the CIA, the NSA to send in reps to testify. We didn't realize that they were also involved. We have to treat them as though they're children that need to be taken by the hand and led through what is basically a military minefield. And who knows better than those of us who have been on that minefield for many years?
I think that's why they're always saying that they can't come right out with the information because of the military controlling, the military industrial complex being in control. I mean,
all the ratifications.
Yeah, there's all the ramifications, all the things that
and many of those ramifications are political in nature.
Political, and also to do with, and I believe this, they have a lot to do with the way our power structure is in this country in regards to energy.
Yes.
Like petroleum-based energy, because if we lose petroleum-based systems, then we have to start accepting like zero-point energy and things of that nature from UFO crashes and whatnot, right? Then people are going to start asking, especially scientists, they're going to start asking, where did they come from? How did they get here?
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to bring up zero-point energy and all these technologies they've had under wraps for years.
That is certainly a possibility, though I still lean towards it being a cover-up of ignorance. And that one of the flight engineers, his name was Sergeant Bill Ennis, William Ennis, of the 393rd Bomber Squadron at Roswell. And he was in charge of the silver plates, the B-29s. He would describe how, as a flight engineer, a flight mechanic, they could take those aircraft apart down to the last rivet and put them back together again. And before he died, he said to me, Don, before I go, I'd like you to find out how that damn thing flew back in 1947. It didn't have a moving part on it. Wow. So what do you reverse engineer?
Right.
No moving parts.
Right. I've heard that. Yeah, they look like they're just printed. Like they are
but it's thought projection.
Right.
And so we get back to the telepathy, the idea that the mind is able to also control the craft that you are within.
Right.
And well, we're to self-driving cars, aren't we?
Right. And
So,
some of those are very dangerous.
Yeah, but we're the rookies.
Yep, we're the rookies. I want a self-driving flying saucer personally, but that's me. And then
Well, mine's double parked, so I need to get in it very soon. So
okay. Well, I want to say thank you to you, Don, for coming to our show tonight. You've been very gracious with your time. A lot of people in the chat room have been participating, and they've been hanging on your every word. Tom, do you have any comments?
I just want to thank Don too, as well. You were on the show for quite some time, and I think this is one of the best interviews I've certainly ever had with you. It was fantastic. I mean, a very forthcoming, inspiring, interesting, detailed.
Covered a lot, and I thank you both. I will see you in Roswell, Tom.
I'll see you there.
I look forward to the day, Tom, I see you walking into the museum at Roswell.
Oh, yes, I will. And someday I will meet you, Don, and I will shake your hand. Yes, I will, sir.
I will look forward to that.